This event brings like-minded people together, people who have a desire to bring change in the lives of millions of people across the world, but more particularly in Africa. We are united here with one vision, one dream.
And now I'd like to turn the floor over to our wonderful panel, led by Dr. Michael Clark. So Michael, I'll give you the reins here.
We're good. All right. Thank you. Feedback is good, but only if you plan for it. Good evening, good afternoon. We're here today to talk about the Sustainable Development Goals. But we need to unpack exactly what these Sustainable Development Goals actually are. The world came together in New York this past September to formally approve the Sustainable Development Goals as targets for social and economic development over the next 15 years. The SDGs were developed over many years through a very complex and complicated series of consultations, workshops, focus groups, meetings, debates, compromises, and arguments. In other words, it was a classic UN exercise. It's clear that the road to achieving the SDGs is going to be long and difficult. And to make it even more challenging, we have no maps, no GPS to help us get there. However, Western, on the other hand, has a very rich resource. And what we did today was to bring together some very capable guides to help us down that road. How are we going to get to those Sustainable Development Goals in the next 15 years? So in the order in which they will be speaking, Bipasha Barua is an associate professor and a Canada Research Chair in the Women's Studies and Feminist Research Unit on campus. Henri Boilly, a long-standing friend of mine, is a professor in the French Studies Department. As part of his innovative teaching strategies, he has designed a course that focuses on understanding Rwandan culture and history surrounding the early 1990s genocide. Yolanda Babeko-Mold is an assistant professor in the Women's Health program in the School of Nursing. Her research investigates Canadian and international involvement in nursing education. Dr. Babeko-Mold is involved in the Western Initiative Maternal, Newborn, and Child Health in Rwanda that works to prepare key health educators in Rwanda to become trainers. Bipasha, you've now got 3 minutes, starting now.
So, much like the MDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs are a global social contract. And the 17 SDGs form a blueprint that has been agreed to by all the world's countries and the world's leading development institutions. Gender equality, number 5, is a goal in and of itself, but gender equality is also an explicit cross-cutting theme in many of the other goals. So if you look at the sub-goals, there are specific references to gender equality in one way or another, in goals about poverty, food security, health, education, water and sanitation, inclusive cities and human settlements, inclusive economic growth, as well as combating climate change. In the SDGs, other aspects of gender equality, such as access to land, natural resources, property ownership, inheritance rights, technology, financial services, issues of sexual violence, sexual and reproductive rights, secondary and technical education, issues faced by migrant women have also been explicitly articulated. At the same time, there are still blind spots, oversights, and what I like to think of as willful ignorances. The goals on education, for example, do not recognize any concern about sort of educational underachievement of boys, which in many countries is a greater problem today than sort of women's primary education, that there is genuine and well-founded concern about boys and men in terms of education in many parts of the world. There's no mention of gender equality in access to and employment in renewable energy, and this is a personal pet peeve because I actually do research on renewable energy. There's no mention of employment in transportation systems and infrastructure, although transportation systems and infrastructure are themselves goals, the goal about sustainable use of land, forests, and protection of biodiversity talks about social justice for local communities without specific reference to gender, even though women, and particularly Indigenous women's roles in stewardship of natural resources is well documented. On the other hand, I found it quite refreshing to see very direct language about the importance of reducing or phasing out fossil fuel subsidies. Similarly, one last point, it's refreshing to see the inclusion of women's sexual and reproductive rights and health as a specific goal instead of the more depoliticized and decontextualized maternal and newborn child health, which pretty much ignores the needs of women related to anything other than childbearing. So women's health basically equals maternal health, women as walking wombs kind of a thing. It's pretty hard for anyone to be against maternal and newborn child health. I mean, these are, to use a pun, motherhood and apple pie issues. Sexual and reproductive rights, on the other hand, are a different matter. That's when we're talking about abortion, contraception, sexual pleasure, basically empowering women to enjoy sexuality without, procreation. And there's no specific language in the SDGs about safe and legal abortion or sex education. So it's kind of a mixed bag. It's progressive, but in my opinion, doesn't go far enough on many issues.
Hello, everybody. I want to start with recognizing that these goals have been uttered many times before. I believe that what we need now is really, and which we don't see in these global goals, is the real actions. What is going to happen? How are they going to really improve human dignity? Human dignity it's what we all want. Repeating maybe some of the things that Dr. Francis told us in his keynote speech. We are all human beings and we all share humanity. Human dignity to me in the cultures I know means really humanness. It means humanness. It means being considerate to other human beings. But when we see the wars, the conflicts that are now almost everywhere in the world, and the UN has had 3 meetings of the Security Council, which didn't really come up with anything, any action to stop the violence, which some people are, including the European Union, are close to call genocide happening today. So what the goals, yes, they are beautiful goals. They are very nice to read in beautiful sentences, well constructed, but where is the action? Where are the actions that will lead us to a peaceful world? We all belong, and this is really my conviction, we all belong to the human race, and we should all feel concerned when we see that some people, some communities are living in tragedy. My last word would be that as Westerners, as people from everywhere, young and adults, we should all work for the betterment of humanity, for the betterment of that humanity that we all share, and make sure that the poor, the vulnerable, the victims of violence are all protected, as we all would want to be.
Let me start with a quote from Ban Ki-moon, Secretary General of the United Nations, when he presented a report in 2015 about the SDGs. And I quote, "Yet for all the remarkable gains, I'm keenly aware that inequalities persist and that progress has been uneven. The world's poor remain overwhelmingly concentrated in some parts of the world. In 2011, nearly 60% of the world's 1 billion extremely poor people lived in just 5 countries. Too many women continue to die during pregnancy or from childbirth-related complications. Progress tends to bypass women and those who are lowest on the economic ladder, or disadvantaged because of their age, disability, or ethnicity. And disparities between rural and urban areas remain pronounced." When I look at these list of goals, they're all in discrete, pretty boxes with pretty colors. And it's interesting because the first thing that comes to mind is that for me they're not discrete. one informs the other and they're all interconnected. So my initial concern when I see an image like this is I understand the need to present something that looks interesting and palpable and something that maybe people can take on and say, okay, I can try to address goal number 10. But for me, in my head philosophically, I can't address goal number 3 without looking at goal number 4 and number 5. What I'm suggesting is that the discussion really isn't around discrete goals and meeting discrete targets, but really thinking about how all of these elements intertwine to address issues of humanity in terms of poverty and inequality and social injustice. And we really need to ask ourselves, beyond the prettiness of all of this, how are corporations going to be accountable in helping to advance these targets beneath these goals? Who has power and how is that going to be wielded to advance these goals or to throw walls and barriers? I don't want to suggest that these goals are unimportant in any way. I think without them it's a huge disservice because then people, if it's not seen, it's not written down, and it's not marketed, then it just can disappear and go off our radar. So it has to be out there in some way. But we also have to figure out what exists that's tangible and realistic that can be attended to, and what's missing, what are the gaps, and what are the barriers that really perpetuate social injustice in some of this.
Equity means fairness and justice. It also means equality in terms of relationships amongst people. So what can the projects here at Western, what can we do to ensure that our partnerships are truly founded on those principles of equity and justice?
This is a problem that we've had for many years, starting with colonization itself, the way the West related to the rest of the world, especially to Africa, and I would say to all other colonized countries. The North, the relationship between the North and the South has not been able to achieve true partnership. It's been mainly going to the countries we want to help with our own agendas, of what education should be, democracy should be, what health should be, and these without really taking into account the needs of the real communities, the needs of the real countries that we are helping. True relationship, again, would need that they all go together. They sit down around the table and look at the situation with shared perspectives and see how to solve the problems. Especially listen to those who need help. And also, it's not really saying that these people always need help, because we should also see that, recognize that the West also gets something from the rest. We can learn more about humanity, humanness. Let me use a word that is dear to me in the African culture, the African cultures, Ubuntu, for instance, which means humanness, humanity, generosity, considering the other not as the opposite of what you are, but the person, the other as a person who really is a complement to your own humanity. We'd better go, if we really want true partnership, we'd better go with the conviction that we are going to talk and help equal human beings, that we need to listen to, that have something to teach us.
I have one question before we turn it over to the audience, and it's for all of you. The criteria that are used to evaluate the career of an academic at Western are fixed and rigid and revolve around research publications and grants which are seen as far removed from the reality of day-to-day existence in a low and middle income country. How then can an academic researcher based in a Canadian university meaningfully contribute to reaching the SDGs?
Yeah, I try to stay away from absolutes as well. I mean, there is a certain performance that is expected of us as academics, and that influences our career trajectories. I agree, grants, publications. But there are always ways to accommodate people in very interesting ways. Like whenever I have grants, I always include, they're always collaborative with NGOs or think tanks, in different parts of the world. And I always take it upon myself to make sure that staff from those organizations also get something out of that project. Training, capacity building, whether they want to come here and, do a master's program. So there's always ways to, I think, make work meaningful if we want to. If we're, especially if we're motivated by that. If we really are just motivated by advancing in our careers, it can be done without any of those things. But I do think that there is room for building in, perhaps not perfect solutions, but for making a real difference on the ground.
I see, for instance, when I take my students to Rwanda, I think that every year I take, for the last 6 years I've been taking students to Rwanda for 5 weeks to work with the communities. I believe that helping our young people really think and act and grow as global citizens. I see during those 5 weeks, I see my students grow every day. I see them grow. I personally and intellectually. I see them asking very relevant questions. And I would say that I've never been as proud, more proud of my profession as what I experienced with these students when I go to Rwanda. So we can do a lot. We can use the money, the grants and the scholarships, and go out in the world and learn about what the world looks like.
Yolanda, your turn to answer the question.
You're within a system that demands certain things in terms of productivity, but you make a space to enable that to happen, whether that's through service, whether it's through using vacation time and being very intentional in your research grants to build capacity, including partners from other countries, supporting graduate students in other countries, creating those partnerships across borders, across nations. So for me, it's being very intentional about it, because that's part of who I am and how I see my role. But I've been fortunate to have examples in my life of how that works, and it happens, and you can do it.
Thank you very much. Okay, now you've got now a few minutes to ask one question.
All right, Bipasha, so if you were to engage in some subversive activities, and I use the word subversive, in a positive way, right?
How to attend to the gaps in terms of inequities and issues in gender. How do I do that in a context where I need to be very respectful of the systems that are in place and the policies and the people and people's lives, because I leave. And so how is change enacted in a way that's respectful and diplomatic, but actually forthright?
I think I'm guessing that you're talking about things, for example, like, you can take on maternal health, but perhaps not sexual and reproductive health, because that gets us into trouble, right? I think you'll find plenty of allies who are saying the same thing, and it doesn't have to be you. So often it's about who's asking for those things, right? And I think that, too often, a lot of things that are passed off as culture, they're not. At the end of the day, think about FGM, right? Genital mutilation. Say, oh, it's part of the culture. It's actually not, and that's why many countries have independently said. Uganda, Senegal, Nigeria just banned it. They did it on their own, so they didn't need, saviors from wherever to go and say stop doing this. It served its purpose, and at one point, people decided that it doesn't work anymore. They don't need it because culture is also dynamic. It's not static. It doesn't stay what it was 500 years ago, right? So people, I think, harmful practices, will eventually, people get rid of them themselves, in a sense, right? So I don't don't think it's our job to be going and getting rid of, but I care. I think it is important, I think, to focus on sort of the more baseline universal indicators, which is why I do like the focus on, I mean, part of it, I do like the focus on the Sustainable Development Goals, because I think there is, first of all, it's nice to have these goals laid out because they are universal goals. I don't think anywhere in the world, as long as these are goals that mean the same thing everywhere, I think everybody wants those things because of our common humanity. No one wants to die at 35. No one wants children dying below the age of 5. Maybe we disagree about what forms education should take, but I don't think there's any society in the world which says it's great to be uneducated. Do you know what I mean? So I think that it's our role, perhaps, to focus on those universal goals, which is why I like them, because I think they can also be far more inclusive of a common humanity and far more inclusive of cultural difference. But there are harmful practices that I think get couched as culture quite often. But I don't think that we need to step in to help people get rid of them. I think people get rid of them themselves because it makes sense and because culture is dynamic and evolves over time.
I think there's work to do here, and I think young folks, elderly folks, all have a role to play in creating change at home, whether that your home be in Africa or be it in Canada. We can make a difference, and we have to show that. I want to thank our 3 panelists for being brave and courageous and willing to stand up in front and tell us not only what they know, and this is something I'm constantly telling my students, they've heard this forever, I'm not interested in what you know, I'm interested in what you think. And you've done a great job of telling us what you think based on what you know. So thank you very much, and thank you for your attention. It's been great.